In this podcast, we discuss death, specifically the death of children, grief, depression, suicide, and religious ideologies. We've done our best to approach these topics with compassion, but if you think it may upset you, please consider skipping this episode.
Welcome to Read It in Theaters, a podcast where I read it.
And I watch it.
I'm LB.
And I'm Hava, and today we're talking about What Dreams May Come.
I hated this book so much.
That's fantastic, because I love this movie so much.
I know. I've seen the movie like a decade ago at least.
Yeah.
And it's a really good movie.
It's great.
So when I read the book the first time, this is the second time I've read it. When I read it the first time, I was like, what is this? And then I think I mentioned on the end of the last podcast that it was a major drag and I was not looking forward to it. It holds up.
But you did it for us. There was this quote I was desperately trying to find. It seems to have been expunged from the internet because I swear that I read it on the Wikipedia article either for the movie or for the book years ago, just because I was reading about it one time. And it was a quote about how Richard Matheson, who wrote the book, hated the movie. And it was a quote from one of his colleagues or friends, I can't remember who essentially said it would have been a good movie had they based it off your book.
Oh my God.
It's so savage and so disparaging of the movie. And I was trying so hard to find that quote. I can't find it anywhere. Instead, I found this quote from Richard Matheson, which from what you've told me about the book is so incorrect, but I guess he can't be 100% wrong, but he said, "I think What Dreams May Come is the most important, effective book I've written. It has caused a number of readers to lose their fear of death, the finest tribute any writer could receive."
I mean, he would think that.
I mean, apparently
Maybe
people
he's right.
have said that to him.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't think that this book is trying to tell a story. And in that sense, what he's trying to do is very effective.
Okay.
But he's not trying to tell a story. He's trying to convince people of his own personal ideology, which he spends a lot of time on.
Cool. Isn't that what he did with a bunch of his writing?
That I don't know. I've only read 2 things by him.
Okay, I watched a movie that he wrote based off of one of his novels for the next podcast episode, and it ended up not being relevant, but that one was clearly just, I'm Richard Matheson and here's my ideology.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like maybe in that case a lot of his ideology slipped into his writing in general, but in this one it's really a good half of the book is spent on trying to tell you about the afterlife and how it works in intricate detail rather than telling a story.
Interesting. So the movie is really emotional. It's very emotionally driven. It's about a family that suffers just tragedy upon tragedy. This couple's 2 children die in a car accident, and then 4 years later, the husband dies. And it's
interesting.
And it's his journey through accepting his own death, accepting that he can't be with his wife anymore, and then later, the wife dies by suicide, and he ventures down into hell to rescue her. And it's
more or less.
It's all just super emotional. I mean, I cry 5 minutes in and then just keep crying for the rest of the 2-hour runtime. It's devastatingly sad.
More or less, that's what the book is about. It's a man named Chris who dies in a car accident. All of their children are still alive, though.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they put just an extreme amount of emphasis on Ian praying, their youngest son praying. It it really saves his soul from being stuck on Earth.
Oh, okay.
In the state of purgatory. Just because Ian's praying and no one knows it. It's secret praying.
Wait.
And, yeah.
Wait, so Ian praying is what allows Chris to leave purgatory?
In part.
Okay.
So first off, before we get too far into it, I do want to read you a little bit of the introduction by Richard Matheson.
Okay.
So it's a page long. I won't read the whole thing. But he says, because its subject is survival after death, it is essential that you realize before reading this story that only one aspect of it is fictional, the characters and their relationships. With few exceptions, every other detail is derived from extensive research.
What kind of research can prove the afterlife?
Yeah. Despite the wide variation with regards to authors and times and places of publication, there is a persistent, unavoidable uniformity to their content, which, now that I have read that and also read the 6-page bibliography,
Holy shit.
that's not true. There's only like 2 books that aren't published in the Western world, and most of them were published in the 70s, so like, that's
Cool.
just... There's like 5 that don't fit the mold, so...
Again, this seems to be Richard Matheson insisting that he's correct, because in the movie that I watched, there was a similar introduction where it had a quote from a psychic who advised the English royals, saying that everything in the movie, aside from the story and the characters, could very well have been true, and I'm a psychic, so therefore I'm right.
True. Could very well have been true absolutely kills me, because it's like, you can say anything and then be like, that very well could be true. You cannot disprove it, therefore.
Yeah. Yeah, it was wild. It was that movie was a lot, but
okay, so Chris dies.
yeah, so how does he die in the book?
He dies of a car accident.
Okay.
And then...
Is he a doctor in the book?
No. Is he a doctor in the movie?
He's a pediatrician. And the reason he dies is because he sees a car accident, gets out to help, and then there's a pileup and he gets hit by another car.
That's really interesting, because he's an author. Right, of course. He's an author in this book. I couldn't think of it for a second, then I was like, oh, right. It's a self-insert. It's openly a self-insert. He's like, Chris is me, Anne is my wife.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
How uncreative.
Anyway, he's an author. But when he's... Big spoilers, in case you weren't aware. When he's reincarnated in the end of the book, he chooses to be a doctor. To continue infantilizing his wife, but we'll get there.
Okay. Tight.
So he dies. And I think 90% of the first half of this book could be cut. This book was so long. And again, it's because he's not trying to tell a story. He's trying to explain his ideology. And so there were... you could easily cut 100 pages from this. Easily.
Damn.
Because so much of it is repetitive and making sure to just really hammer home
that he's a Christian.
Well, it's not exactly Christian beliefs. A lot of it takes from the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Interesting.
But it's he spends a lot of time on it. And one of the things that I found extremely irritating was that the very beginning of the book is that just wild introduction from the author. And then a psychic shows up at his brother's house and gives him a manuscript and is like, this is from your brother Chris. And his brother Robert is like, hey, fuck you, Chris has been dead for a year. And she's like, yeah, I know, take this so I can get on with my life. And the manuscript is the book that Chris, had her automatically write,
I was going to say, was it automatic writing? That is so wild.
Yeah. So one of the things that really bothers me, and this kind of bothers me anyway, like when people write in an accent.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's like spelled out phonetically instead of just a word, and then you're like, and they had an accent. Like, it just really bothers me. It makes it really unreadable.
Yeah, it's pretty gauche to do that these days.
Mm-hmm. And so I counted, because it is 12 times in the first 12 pages, they have these little asides where I only wrote down one, and it's the worst one for some. There was a really good one that I can't remember what it was. It's Mimbins were compressed. No, try again. Spell slowly. MEMB rains. Yes.
What?
So he spells out membranes because she like hears it wrong when he's telling it to her as a spirit. And right, so you have
That's
this
not
little.
how automatic writing works.
I mean, they didn't actually say automatic writing, so it could have been.
Okay.
But yeah, so there's this little aside to the medium that he found to write this manuscript for him, and like, has she never heard of editing? Like, she knows it's supposed to be membranes now, right? And like, this is the 70s, so it's probably on a typewriter, but like, you could just retype that one page, or like use whiteout maybe.
Sure.
Like, you can edit it. This is, you made a typo, and then you left not only the typo, but the notes from the editor in your finished work.
That's so funny.
But, when you're first starting out a book, you're not, like, invested in it yet.
Yeah.
And so to have it be not only slow and seems pointless and you're just starting out, so you're not invested at all, and that happens once a page.
Oh.
Yeah. It's like, why are you doing this? This completely ruins the flow of what you're saying. I'm trying to explain this incredibly complex aspect of dying, and I'm gonna just full stop and have an editor's note.
Yeah, that's a weird choice.
Weird choice. Really bothersome.
So what is the process of dying in the book?
So it's a tiny bit unclear because he stops every page to have a note to the editor.
Right.
And so he dies, and then he's in like this fugue state almost where he can't see more than like 10 feet in front of him, and everything is like gray and washed out. And there's time skips, so he like is in the hospital and sees his dead body, but is like, well, that's not me because I'm standing right here, so that can't be me. Clearly I remember being in a car accident, so I'm probably in surgery and this is a weird dream, and he like insists to himself that it's a dream. And then he like hops around, time jumping whenever he hears Anne crying, which I did think was like an interesting thing because they established that they're soulmates.
Oh, okay. Like right off the bat?
No, they don't reveal it officially until the end, but there is a quote right in the beginning of the book. He goes, I could still hear the sobbing even though Anne was silent. It's in our minds, or it's in her mind. Our minds are so close that I could still hear it. Wow. And that's at his funeral. She's sitting there silently, but he can like hear her sobbing.
Wow.
And so anytime she's feeling an extreme amount of grief, it like stops his process of moving on to the afterlife.
That is so interesting because in the movie, it's almost reversed. In the film, he can't let her go, and so he's hanging around as a spirit. And every time he tries to reach out to her and comfort her, sort of, because he's seeing her grief, it makes it worse. And so he eventually has to choose to move on because he realizes that hanging around as a spirit is just hurting Anne.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't say that that's incongruent with the book, but it definitely, if I was going to pick a direction for it to go, it would be Anne grieving is making him stay.
So it's like a different framing of the same situation.
Yeah, and there's a whole thing, and again, this is more explaining his ideology than anything important to the story, although it was kind of interesting. Like this, you might leave in to make a story where like he feels his soul coming out of his body, and then there's like a golden tether leading from the head of the dead body to the head of his spirit, and that has to be severed in order for him to move on. Yeah, like not all of it was uninteresting, but it was just like, why are we still talking about that? He doesn't get to the afterlife until a full quarter through the book.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think he gets it. I think he enters the afterlife like maybe 20 minutes into the film. Because I'm pretty sure their children die like 7 minutes into the movie,
Mm-hmm.
which is weird because it doesn't seem like it's that fast.
Yeah.
Because the movie, again, it's so like emotionally driven, and I think that the score really helps like put you into the mindset and the feelings of the characters right from the get-go. And so, because I texted you, because I started crying when the kids died.
Yeah.
And so I texted you, and I think I said 7 minutes in, and I'm already crying.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time the children die, you already know so much about this family. It's crazy how much they can pack into those first 7 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, this was very... I feel like the writing style was very removed from the emotions of it, excluding Chris's own emotions. Like, it was very revolved around what Chris was feeling.
So I want to know if there's any use of like visual metaphor in the book, because
Absolutely
the movie
not.
is okay. So the movie is like nothing but visual metaphor. It's beautiful.
Okay.
And I want to talk about how they use colors to kind of manipulate the viewer's feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and also to keep the viewer like tied to points of the story. Like they use colors to make sure you're remembering everything you need to remember,
I love that.
which is really cool. So I noticed 4 main colors that they use the most, I think, which the first one is red, which is right in the beginning. The first scene is Chris and Annie meeting when they're both traveling through, no, near Switzerland. Can't quite remember. But they meet on a lake. They're both on boats, and Annie's sail is red, and she's wearing an all-white dress with like a red sarong tied around her waist. And that's the point of the many of the shots, is to show the bright red of her outfit and her boat, the sail of her boat. And then we see red again when Chris dies. He dies, like I said, in a car accident, but it's in a tunnel. And so there's this red glow in the distance of taillights that lights up the tunnel with red the moment that he dies.
You guys thinking of Anne?
Well, he does die thinking of Anne. But it's also, to me, I think the red in the movie shows like progression, because meeting Anne was a huge turning point in his life. And so that is marked by the red of her boat and her sarong. And then when he first loses Anne, it's when he dies, and there's red there. The next time that red is notable is he has to take a boat from heaven to hell. And that boat also has a red sail.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So his next, as he's traveling to find Anne in hell, he gets on a boat with a red sail. And then lastly, he ends up saving her from hell. And they, in the end of the movie, talk about rebirth. Like they agree to be reborn together. And she's wearing a red dress in that scene. So it's sort of like every time something pivotal happens in Chris's life related to Anne, there's red.
That's interesting.
So it shows sort of like a progression and an action and an important point.
I want to take a second to talk about the boat.
Okay.
Because although it's kind of weird, because I feel like this book made a point to be like, this has nothing to do with the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. And yet...
but it clearly does.
There's so much symbolism. So I think it's interesting that they take a boat in the book. There's not anything like that, in the movie. There's not anything like that in the book. But in Purgatorio by Dante Alighieri, which is the second book of the Divine Comedy, you take a boat to get to Purgatory.
Interesting.
And then you climb a mountain in order to get to heaven. And so I think that it's interesting that they had him take a boat to get to hell.
Yeah, there's several scenes with boats. And water is another huge metaphor used in the movie, where, again, almost like every time something big happens, I guess it's almost like every time he starts to lose his connection to Annie, he ends up like submerged in water somehow.
I think that's a really interesting thing to take from the book. I think that that's really smart in order to give it a through line, because in the book he talks a lot about how they like water. I think they met at a beach, and they like sailing, but it doesn't really have anything to do with anything. He's just talking.
Okay.
So I think that's really smart for them to have picked up on that and been like, oh, we can turn this into a metaphor.
Yeah, I feel like water is almost used in conjunction with the colors in the film to kind of connect Chris's memories and his emotions. Because the movie does a lot of flashbacks.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, if we're flashing back to one of Chris's memories, there's some contact with water as he transitions from his present in either heaven or hell back to a memory of his life on Earth.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so one of the ones that I thought was really cool is there's obviously the first scene in the film where he and Annie meet on a lake. But the very next scene, we see them get married and then we see them with their children. And it's like a rainy day where they're having a water fight in the backyard. So there's like garden hose and everyone's soaking wet and laughing. And it's like this really great memory that Chris has. And he goes back to that memory a couple of times as he's traveling through heaven and hell, as well as a memory of him with his son Ian, where they played hooky from school and work and went out into a forest and it was raining that day.
I love that.
Right. So there's one point where he has this like soulmate connection to Annie that's guiding him through hell towards her. And he starts to lose it because he thinks about Ian instead. And he falls out of the boat and into the sea that they're on. And while he's falling through the water in hell, he falls sort of back in time to that day with Ian in the woods. And he remembers like fond things about his son. But he does so through water.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So, does he have another person with him, like a Virgil, basically, a guide?
Yeah, he has two.
Okay.
So, when he first dies in the movie, he is like trapped on Earth because he can't let go. He can't admit that he's dead.
Mm-hmm.
And similar to what you were saying, it's like he can't always see things clearly. And so at first he's just like we just hear his thoughts. We don't see him anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And he can see everything related to his wife and his life on Earth very clearly. But this man who has appeared and is like his guide is really blurry. He can't see him clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And at first he mistakes this man as like the doctor who was operating on him. And then he comes to realize that it is the doctor he interned under when he was becoming a pediatrician.
Interesting.
So his name's Albert, and he was like Chris's
cousin.
Like, what? No.
Yeah, it's Chris's cousin in the book.
Oh, weird. No, in the movie, it's like his mentor who died years ago.
I like that
and then
way
they
better.
reconnect in death.
I like that way better because he gets to heaven and is like, oh, it's Albert, my cousin who died forever ago that I barely knew.
Nope. Nope. In the movie, it's his mentor. And he's played by Cuba Gooding Jr., who does just a fantastic job.
I love that.
Fantastic job. And one of the things I do want to say, okay, I want to talk about this because it's one thing that I think could be criticized about the movie, is they definitely play with physical representation, but they do so through changing people's race. So the Albert that he meets, played by Cuba Gooding Jr., is actually his son Ian, who has chosen to take on the form of Albert so that he can guide his father through death in the appearance of a man that his father respects, instead of trying to convince him to listen to his son.
So Ian dies.
Ian dies.
All their children die in the beginning?
They only have 2 children in the movie, and they both die in the beginning.
Okay. For some reason, I thought that Ian was still alive.
Nope, the kids die first, and there's only 2 of them.
Okay.
Yeah, so the kids die in a car accident when they're teenagers. 4 years later, Chris dies in a car accident. And when he dies, his son Ian is his guide to heaven, but he appears as Albert. And he lets Chris believe that he's Albert. And it's not until the end of the movie that Chris realizes that it's not Albert, it's Ian. So there's that, and obviously, like, it's Robin Williams, so they're a white family, and then Cuba Gooding Jr., who's black.
Yeah, that's a little questionable.
It's a little questionable. I've thought about it for days, trying to figure out what about it feels not quite correct to me.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really put my finger on it, I think because I'm white.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. Because the other thing is, he sees his daughter in heaven too, and she chooses to appear as an Asian woman. And later, he meets the actual spirit of Albert, who has now chosen to appear as a white man. And the way that it's explained in the movie through the actual character of Albert, he says that, well, they establish first that heaven is whatever you want it to be.
Yeah.
You think it, and it that's what it looks like, including the way you present yourself. So you can choose to be whatever you want.
Yeah, they spend about 6 chapters explaining that concept.
Cool. It's pretty concise in the film. So the way that Ian as Albert explains it first is just that one body is as good as any other, and it's all window dressing. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that the real Albert explains it is who you are in life gets in the way of your relationships to each other in heaven. So who's the father, who's the son, who's the mentor, who's the student, none of that really matters in death. So they oftentimes will choose to appear drastically different so that they can get to know the real people without all of that earthly, like, social structure getting in the way.
Huh.
Which I think is really interesting. I just don't know if it was necessary to make so many different characters either be people of color or stop being people of color.
Yeah.
So I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah, it feels, I mean, the way that it's explained makes it, but the thing is, it's going to be consumed by people on Earth that are living in a society, and
Exactly.
it feels like you're dressing up as a person of color.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. I can't have a clear opinion on it because I'm white.
Yes.
And so
Same.
from my perspective, it seems like a minor point. Like, it's maybe not, quote, that bad in terms of racism, but that's not my place to decide.
Exactly.
So I did want to mention that as a potential criticism, but I don't have any particular feelings on it because I don't quite get it.
Yeah.
I don't remember what my point was in bringing that up. I don't remember what we were talking about.
I asked if he had a guide, and you told me about
yes.
Albert.
So he has Albert, who is Ian. He has Ian as Albert, and then later he has real Albert.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And for a period of time when they first set out towards hell, both of them are with him.
Interesting.
And at the beginning of that journey, he thinks Ian is Albert, and he thinks that Albert is just a dude. He doesn't have any idea that it's someone he knows.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So in the book, it's just Albert. It's
Okay.
Albert comes to him when he's in his fugue state on Earth and tries to get him to move on, but he can't because Anne is grieving. Grieving is not allowed, by the way.
Okay.
It's bad. Everyone who grieves is a bad person.
Okay, cool. I want to get into that in a minute because I love how the movie handles grieving.
So Albert comes to him in his fugue state, and then when he finally does move on and is in heaven, in Summerland, as it's called in the book, Albert is there, and they talk, and then Albert also accompanies him to hell, much as Virgil does. Again, like, there's all this... I feel like the book purposefully was being like, no, Dante's Inferno is not correct, and then has all of these parallels.
Cool.
Like, when he gets to Summerland, there's no sun, and there's also no shadows. And
okay.
right, and I sent you a Discord message, I remember, because Virgil doesn't have a shadow in Purgatorio, and I'm like, what? And it's because he's made of spirit stuff, and therefore doesn't cast a shadow, but I just thought that it was interesting that Chris gets to Summerland, and nothing casts a shadow.
Well, I feel like that's more to do with the fact that there is no light source, less to do than the fact that they're made out of spirit stuff.
Yeah, I suppose.
I mean, if there's no light source, there can be no shadows.
Well, except everything is just, like, ambiently lit. Like,
Right.
yeah. But I mean, that's still just a weird, like, why not have a sun? Why make the choice to have there be no sun and no shadows when that, again, draws a direct parallel to the Divine Comedy?
Yeah, interesting.
And also having Albert accompany him to hell, like, actually into hell, through a bunch
It's Virgil and Dante.
Right. And they go through circles, and so this...
Wait. Before we get into hell, I want to back up. Because I want to talk about the grief.
Yes. I want to just go first because mine's going to be really short. It's just one paragraph.
Yeah, go for it.
The attitudes of people toward those who have died is vital, you see, Robert, because it's addressed to his brother, right? Since the consciousness of the deceased is so vulnerable to impressions, the emotions of those left behind can have a powerful effect on it. Intense sorrow creates a vibration which actually causes pain to the departed, holding them back from progression. Actually, it's unfortunate that people mourn the dead, prolonging the adjustment to the hereafter. The deceased need time to reach their second death. The funeral ceremony was meant to be a medium of peaceful relief, not a ritual of grief.
What?
You're not allowed to grieve. It's bad. You're a bad person.
Wow. That is so messed up.
Right?
I mean, that is so counter to my own belief system.
Oh, right.
That it's wild to me. Because I personally believe that grief, all the things that happen after someone dies, is for the living. It's to give us comfort. Absolutely. And that the person who's dead doesn't care anymore. They're moving on.
And we'll get into this later with their condemnation of suicide. But...
Yes.
The onus being on the people that are living, like, no, you have to behave a certain way or else you're bad.
Okay, so they take that idea in the movie and completely deconstruct it.
Interesting.
So, after the children die, Annie falls into a really, really severe depression and attempts suicide. And we see this mostly through flashbacks. And here is another place where I want to point out the use of color is all of these flashbacks where we see Annie at her greatest suffering. It's all swathed in green.
Interesting.
And to me, I think that green, because it's not just green, but it's living plants. So there are scenes where she's post-suicide attempt is in a hospital. And I'm not sure if it's a recovery center or just a psychiatric hospital or what, but she's outside in this big, expansive green where there are these tall hedges, and she's wearing green pajamas and a green robe that is the exact shade of the grass and the plants.
That is so interesting.
Yes, and Chris is visiting her, and they're sort of discussing things, having these really difficult conversations about her mental health and kind of whether or not they're going to stay together because they're both grieving in such different ways. And he's wearing all earth tones. So there's no green on him. But Annie is all green. And they have these conversations a couple of different times in the film and in different ways where they talk about, like, Annie says that she feels all alone in her grief because Chris doesn't seem to be as sad. And he says that what he's doing is trying to be strong. And he thought that that's what he had to do. That's how he hid from his feelings and how he dealt with his grief was to be strong and not show it. But because of their inability to grieve together, it started to pull them apart. And they have this whole conversation about, like, if they're going to get a divorce. He, like, has a plane ticket and he says, I'll leave if you don't want me here because it seems like I'm just making it worse and I'm hurting you. And through this sort of very emotional conversation, they end up talking about the things that they weren't able to talk about, and it's what keeps them together.
That's really interesting.
Right. So there's no condemnation of grieving in the right way or that grief is bad. It's just grief is hard and people do it in different ways. And the way to be there for each other oftentimes is just to talk about it. And I like that they have that conversation with all of this greenery around them. And the next sequential thing that we see from them is a moment where it's been a year since then, and they're talking about celebrating it as an anniversary because it's the day that they didn't get a divorce.
I like that.
Yeah, they call it the double D anniversary because it's Annie didn't die and they didn't get a divorce, so it's 2 Ds. And they're discussing celebrating it and doing something nice because it's been a whole year since that day. And we see them both clothed in blue, sitting on a couch in their house, and the couch is surrounded by foliage. They just have huge houseplants all around them. I like that green sort of shows growth, like it's the emotional growth, whereas red shows a physical progression from one thing to another.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely not how it is in the book.
Cool.
In the book, you're not allowed to grieve.
I hate that.
Right? Well, so their whole idea of getting into heaven there, Matheson's idea that he presents is, it's just bonkers to me.
Bonkers.com?
It is bonkers.com because, so it's like you were saying where everything that matters is what's in your mind. And if you conceive of it, it can happen kind of thing. And they really lean on that. And so they have a version of purgatory that's your life flashing before your eyes. But you are actually reliving all of those moments with intensity. And again, it's a little hard to understand because it's like you're living through your thoughts also. And I'm like, I don't like, are you acting out your thoughts? I'm not sure what you're trying to say here. So, and I have a problem with this anyway, because like when I was younger, I used to really engage with magical thinking, and it's super unhealthy for me at least. And I feel like from what I've read, for people with OCD, it's really unhealthy. For people with intrusive thoughts, it's really unhealthy to be like, actually, your every thought does matter, and you have to reckon with each and every one of those thoughts to get into heaven.
Yeah, and that's a really Catholic way of looking at it, I think.
Yes. Yeah, and I just, not a fan.
No, me either. I think that there's a lot of Catholic ideology woven into the film, whether on purpose or not, specifically in the way they talk about suicide.
So, we were going to talk about hell a little bit.
Yeah, real quick. I just want to note, because I think this is like an amazing thing about the movie. And it goes back to them being soulmates, which I love because I'm always here for soulmates.
Oh my god, I'm weak for soulmates. That's the only reason I don't wish that this book didn't exist. Because sometimes I read really bad books and I'm like, this shouldn't exist. It's bad for people. And the only reason that I can't bring myself to give it that rating in my own head is because I'm so weak for soulmates.
Same. So in the movie, the way that we find out they're soulmates, in the movie, Annie is a painter and an art dealer.
Love that.
And I did read, I think it was either the director or the screenplay writer. I can't remember which one. But, because what does she do in the book?
I think she might also be a painter in the book, but, like, she just doesn't matter.
No, she's something else in the book, because I remember reading this thing about how they were trying to get across the point that heaven is whatever you want it to be, visually, and they couldn't quite, like, figure out how to do that, to, like, merge from Chris being a spirit on Earth into being in a different place that could be anything. So they made the choice to turn Annie into a painter, and when Chris goes to heaven, his heaven is a painting.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and the visual effects are amazing. This movie won the Oscar for visual effects the year it came out.
I love that.
And it really is, I mean, it's so well done that when he walks, it shows his feet smearing the paint on the ground, and he's like on this hill full of wildflowers, and he picks up a flower and it turns into oil paint in his hand.
Oh my god.
It's really amazing. And so when he first arrives in heaven, the way that he processes it is through paint, because that's like the language that he and Annie share. And then later, the way we find out they're soulmates is a tree appears in his heaven that he didn't put there. And at first, Albert Ian as Albert says like, things like that happen. Your brain is, or your imagination is sort of doing this automatically now. So things might change that you didn't do on purpose. But it ends up being that Annie painted that tree and Chris saw it in his heaven.
I love that.
And then it gets immediately sad because Annie on Earth is still talking to Chris in her mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's how she's coping. And so it shows her painting it, and she's like saying like, what about this, Chris? Do you think that this looks good? Like, she's like, as she's painting it, she's in her head like discussing it with him. And then she has this moment of horrible grief where she's like, I don't know why I think that you can see this. I'm being crazy. And she pours paint thinner all over it and destroys the painting. It's so sad. Oh God, it guts me. That scene is so sad because then the tree in Chris's heaven starts to die.
Wow.
And he can feel Annie's pain, and he knows that she's suffering without him.
Wow.
It's so sad, but
wow, I love that.
yeah, no, it's amazing. And the whole movie is like that. There are these connections between them because they're soulmates, and that's how he like decides that he can save her from hell.
Wow.
Is because she dies by suicide. And here's where I want to get into how they treat suicide in this movie, because it's my biggest criticism. I hate it. So Ian as Albert comes to him and says, Annie has killed herself. Mm-hmm. And Chris has his moment of grief. Mm-hmm. And then he immediately is like, but it's okay because, she's not in pain anymore. And I'll get to see her. She's here now.
Nope.
Right? No, she's not. And the way that it's explained in the movie is that there's a natural order to things, and each of us has an intrinsic knowledge of how our journey on Earth is supposed to go. But when you commit suicide, you've severed that connection and you've changed things, and now you end up in a place somewhat like hell. Yep. They use the word hell in the movie, but they make it clear that it is not a biblical hell or an actual, like, no one's put them in hell. There's no quote unquote judgment, except there clearly is.
Right. That's what they do in the book too, where he says, I apparently don't have it written down, but he says it's not a law. It's not a punishment. Or no, it is a law. It's not a punishment. It's just the law. And it's like, explain that's the difference to me.
Right. And so in the movie...
It wasn't her decision to make, though.
Yeah. And so in the movie, when Ian as Albert is explaining this to him, Chris gets angry, as he rightfully should. Yeah. And is like, that's not fair. And Ian as Albert is like, there's no judgment. Nobody put her there. It's just the reality. And Chris is like, yeah, and the reality is that suicides go to hell. How's there no goddamn judgment in that?
Right.
And so on the one hand, you have Chris's character who is very correct and very rightfully upset about this, but the movie never like changes its narrative about suicide.
Yeah.
It's still like she messed up, and it's because she's too caught up in her depression and too self-absorbed to admit that she's ruined her path on Earth, and she can't admit what she's done and face it. Therefore, she can't come to heaven because her mind is too tangled up in depression.
Yep. That's more or less.
Which is so harmful for people suffering with depression.
Yeah, in the book, the quote is, it isn't a punishment, it's the law. And Chris says, but she had to be out of her mind with grief. Albert says, if she had been, she wouldn't be where she is. It's as simple as that. No one put her there. The fact that she's there is proof that she made a willful decision.
Yeah, no, that, I hate
Never
that.
mind the fact that studies show that people who are living with suicidal thoughts and behavior and are in the middle of like a suicide attempt hallucinate because they are so out of their mind.
Yes, and speaking from my own personal experience, I went through a really severe depression when I was a teenager and had suicidal thoughts, and was fed the rhetoric that suicide is a selfish choice that only hurts the people that you love. Like, when you're depressed, your thought patterns are so warped. And depression tricks you into thinking no one loves you. And to then be told, oh yeah, those thoughts that you're having that you can't really control, that you would be better off dead, that's selfish. It's like, I don't need more of that. I already think people hate me.
Yeah.
Like, being told that my suicidal thoughts are my choice and that they're selfish just made me feel worse.
Yeah, it's absolute bullshit.
It's horrible. And unlearning that takes a lot of work. So yeah, I hate that the movie does that. I hate that it never changes its narrative. I do like that at least Annie gets saved. She doesn't have to be in hell, and she does get to go to heaven, but it's
never been done before. And in the book,
and no one believes that they can do it.
In the book, Albert is like, this is not possible. And Chris is like, okay, but I'm going to do it, though.
Both Anne and Albert in the movie continually are like, you can't save her. We'll let you go say your last goodbyes to her in hell, but you can't save her.
And so this I don't understand. Is in the book, Annie is only going to be Annie. She's Anne in the book, but
she's Annie in the movie.
So I guess I'm using it interchangeably now.
Yeah, same.
So she is supposed to live for 20, I think it was 24 more years, and then die of something. And because she killed herself, because she completed suicide, she has to spend 24 years in hell instead.
Oh, okay, so it is like a sentence in the book.
She has to spend the rest of her, what would be her natural born life, in hell. And Chris is like, well, I can't let her spend almost a quarter of a decade. I have to go save her. She will just be there suffering. That's horrible. And so Albert says, and I still don't understand why this is the stakes. He's like, okay, but if you go there and lower your vibrations to the point that she can see you and you can interact with her, there's a chance that you could be trapped there forever. Why? Okay. Why wouldn't he be trapped there for 24 years? Because, like, if Annie is only going to be there for 24 years and then will, like, be free, I guess. Like, I don't know. Her vibrations will just spontaneously then why is he trapped forever if he comes down to her level?
God, see, and I don't like that it's like she's sentenced to suffer as much as she was supposed to suffer on Earth. Like, because she was suffering so much, she thought that death would be the way out. That's so messed up.
She was suffering so much that she thought death would be the way out, and so she has to suffer some more. But it's not a punishment.
It's not a punishment. And that's like, that officially gives her no hope of not suffering for that amount of time. Where, like, maybe if she had not chosen suicide, like, you know, maybe things would have gotten better for her. We'll never know. But now you're saying because she completed suicide, she has to suffer. Yeah. There's no other option. That is so bad.
It's terrible.
There's one thing they say in the movie that really made me angry is the real Albert. It's sort of the same deal, only they don't talk about vibrations. It's just because heaven is what you make it, hell is also what you make it, even if it's unintentional, which is why they make a point to say it's not like the biblical hell, because it's just people who can't, like, get out of their own heads and who are inadvertently,
which is kind of from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because there's a belief that you'll be confronted with I forget what they call them, greedy spirits, I think, but they are just projections of your own mind, and if you're capable of realizing that, then you can escape them, but if you think that they're real and fear them, you'll be trapped.
Okay, so the real Albert in the movie, when warning Chris that he could get pulled into Annie's delusions, says suicides can get pretty committed to torturing themselves.
Oh, God.
It keeps framing depression as a choice. Yeah. And I hate that so much.
Same.
Because it's also like, okay, like, I'm sure Chris was miserable. I'm sure he went through some kind of depression after his children dies. There's no way not to when you're suffering that kind of grief. So what? Just because his depression didn't last as long as Annie's, that means that he's free from any self-hatred or free from any feelings of guilt that might taint his heaven. It doesn't make any sense, and it's so demonizing of people who die by suicide. Anyway.
Yeah, not a fan of the way that they treat thoughts, because any stray thought matters. So, you know, how you have that persistent intrusive thought of just like slamming down real hard on your cat when they're on the floor and just breaking their little spine. Um, you know, that intrusive thought everyone has.
You know, that intrusive thought where you're like, what if I just jumped out of this moving
For
vehicle?
sure. That, you're bad for thinking that.
You're bad. You're bad and you chose to think that. Oh, God, yeah. I think they thought they were being compassionate towards mental health, but maybe it's because it came out in like 98, but it could have done a lot better.
It definitely could have.
So tell me about hell in the book.
Okay, so, hello, you want to sit next to me?
Is it a cat?
It's my bean. Hi.
My phone, when we were texting earlier, I typed in beanie and my phone automatically suggested the possessive beanies.
Oh my god.
I want an animal. Both of mine are egged up, ignoring me. They don't love me.
So, this is what made me decide to read Sabriel also, which ended up not being relevant at all, but it was an audiobook and Tim Curry was reading it.
Right.
So I finished it anyway.
Sure.
It was really good. And he has done voiceover work, so like the emotion in the characters' voices was like superb.
Fantastic.
It was
Big
so
recommendation of Sabriel to anyone who hasn't read or listened to it.
God, if you're gonna get the audiobook, I highly recommend
Tim Curry.
Tim Curry.
I
book,
highly recommend Tim Curry, full stop.
Full stop. Every book should be read by a voice actor.
I agree.
Okay, so they go to hell, and there's chunks in the same way that there are in Dante's Inferno and Sabriel, if you will.
Okay.
Although you should not. And there's also like chunks in What Dreams May Come. And the thing that I found super notable, and I think that this is weird, in all three of those, there's a section where you have to climb down a sheer rock face.
Interesting.
I think in Sabriel, it's akin more to a staircase, like a spiral staircase, but it's still like straight down and steep, and it's always the second section that you go to. Like you go through the first section, and then you go through the second section, and then you go down a sheer rock face.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Weird, right?
I remember that from Sabriel.
Yeah. And
Sabriel.
and Dante's Inferno, and this book, where they're going through hell, and they have to lower their vibrations in order to, like, I forget how they describe it. It's like the air is super heavy, and it's hard to breathe, and it's hard to exist there, so they have to lower their vibrations, which makes them more flesh-like, so that they can survive hell.
I don't like that.
Yeah, it's
yucky.
And they run into the denizens of hell, and it's awful.
In the movie, like I said, they have to cross a sea, and sort of, I guess, midway through that, it gets really stormy, and there are all of these, like, naked, gray, gross, half-drowned bodies, like, swimming and overtaking the boat, and that's how, like, Chris falls into the water. And when they get washed ashore, all of those people are, like, also washed ashore, like, in a way that's very much like debris, which is gross and really disturbing looking, but again, the visual metaphor is fantastic, of just all of these gray, nude bodies laying inert on a beach, moaning in agony.
Yikes.
Yeah. And then they come across the gates of hell, which are entangled shipwrecks.
Ooh.
Like in a desert.
Ooh.
It's really cool. And there's a huge, decrepit, rusted aircraft carrier that's labeled as Cerberus.
That's super fascinating.
Isn't it? And I read that they actually filmed on the, like, rusted, decrepit hull of an actual aircraft carrier that was later sunk to make a false reef.
I can't remember which gate Cerberus guards, but he guards one of the gates in Dante's Inferno.
Interesting.
That's
There
one of the
are
things.
no
Go ahead.
there are no like layers of hell or different things they like different levels or chunks of hell in the movie. They all kind of blend into each other,
Mm-hmm.
which I think reflects the idea that the afterlife is what your mind decides it is.
Mm-hmm.
That they see different people in their own personal hells or in shared hells.
Mm-hmm.
And they just have to figure out which one Annie is in.
But it's all in your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're kind of tracking down Annie. Albert is. He can
Yeah.
sense where she is, but only because they go to Annie's funeral and Ian is praying for her at the funeral. And so they
Weird.
show up and Albert is like, be grateful for your Ian. And Chris is like, I'm grateful for all my children. Fuck you. And Albert is like, yeah, but he's praying, and I can pick up on his prayers and figure out where to find her.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm not against having religious ideologies in it.
No, it's just that they lean so heavily on it.
Yeah.
Where, like-
and all in a way that like removes Annie's agency.
Yes, that's really heavy in the book.
Yeah, they don't do that in the movie. She's a really fleshed out, well-written character.
Absolutely not. I don't even know who she is in this book.
Wow, what a shame.
Yeah, but they lean on Ian's praying and prayer to the point that... So Annie dies of suicide,
Mm-hmm.
and when they find her, she's in a replica of their house that they lived in together, but everything's decrepit and dirty.
Yeah, it's like that in the movie too.
Yeah. And Chris spends a little while wandering through the house because he can't find her right away.
Mm-hmm.
And Ian's room is the only one that looks lived in. I wonder why that is.
What the hell?
Uh-huh.
I don't like that.
Yeah, no, it's... So, as far as everything being in your head, it looks like I didn't grab this quote either, but it's something about... So they are in hell, and there's, like, a bunch of people, like you were talking about, like, in the water, except it's not entirely water. Like, there's a pool there.
Oh, okay.
And they attack Chris because he is not Virgil, and so he's not as mentally strong.
Okay.
And so they attack him, like, just for funsies. And there's a somewhat extended sequence. It's about a page long of him being attacked, and they, like, drag him over to the pool, and he drowns. And then when he comes to, they're a ways away. And Albert is like, they only had you for, like, 2 seconds. All that happened in your head.
Oh, weird.
Yeah.
Huh. That's ooky.
Oh, yeah, it was... Not a fan.
There's some real ooky imagery when they get down into hell in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like, within the, sort of on the shipwrecks, there are these people. And this is also, like, we see red in hell in the movie, which it's, like, in the direction that they're initially going. There's sort of people, like, wearing scraps of red fabric, and I think there's, like, a red flag or something. And then Chris realizes that that's not the direction they need to go. So it's another, like, moment where he, like, sees red pulling him in one direction, and then he makes the choice to, like, do something else, which is cool. But on the shipwrecks, there are these, like, bodies. I hesitate to say people because they're, like, just images of people.
Mm-hmm.
Of, like, these trapped souls. And there's one shot of two women sort of sitting hunched over, and they're, like, screaming, but they don't have mouths.
Ooh.
So they're, like, trying to call out and scream, but they can't do it. It's very ooky.
Wow, I do not like that.
Yeah, no, it's very, very ooky. But yeah, that's when Chris realizes that Ian is not Albert. Because they're, like, gearing up to sort of run into the shipwrecks. And there's, like, aggressive souls in there. Like, there's the sad, screaming, mouthless women, but there's also, like, dudes with spears who are, like, angry.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're like...
They were not punished for murdering people. It's just the law that they have to be here because they're murderers.
Shit. Is that in the book?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Wow. No, they're like getting ready to go in there to search for Annie. And in that moment of like bravery or whatever, Chris has a flashback to Ian and realizes that the man in front of him is Ian. And it's, this is such a beautiful moment of acting because they're like ready to go. And Ian is like, let's go, let's do this, we can handle it. And he starts to go forward. And Chris grabs him and is like, no, she's not in there. And Ian starts to like fight him. And Chris is like, your mother's not in there.
Ooh.
And it immediately hits slow motion. The sound fades out. And it's a close-up of Cuba Gooding Jr.'s shocked, emotional face as he turns to look. And it's like this moment where they finally connect. Like he turns and he sees his father and he knows his father sees him for the first time. It's so good. It's beautiful. I love it. And the flashback that he has is the day that they played hooky and they're like running through the woods in the rain and talking about how Ian is struggling in school and sort of what Ian wants to do about it, if he wants to leave school or if he wants to keep trying.
Mm-hmm.
But Ian's whole thing is he feels like he's not good enough. He's not as smart as his dad. He can't do the things his dad can do. And so Chris tries to reassure him and is saying like all the good things about Ian. And he says, if I was going through fucking hell, there's not another man I'd want by my side. And we see that, and then we see it on Chris's face in hell as he's looking at who he thought was Albert. You see it on his face as he realizes it's Ian, and then he grabs him and stops him from running into hell.
Oh my God.
It's so beautiful.
That is so beautiful.
It's amazing.
So he does have a couple flashbacks in the book. I think all of them concern Anne. Mm-hmm. Which, again, it's just crazy to me that she's so infantilized because there's like 3 or 4 flashbacks concerning Anne. I have no idea who she is.
That's so upsetting.
It's so upsetting. Let me read you some select quotes I wrote down.
Oh, please do. I'm ready to be mad.
Anne looked at me with her wicked little girl expression. So that one is not that bad. Because,
yes, it is.
I mean, I see a lot of people make that comparison where, like, you're going to be naughty, so it's, you got that wicked little expression, you know.
But why little girl?
Because children are mischievous. So that one, if that had been the only one, I'd be okay with it if she wasn't infantilized elsewhere. But the other ones, this one is the worst one. I can't get over it. I'm so mad. He describes her as child - woman.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, just. Ooh. That's just not okay.
This child woman.
That is
what?
So problematic.
She shook her head, looking like a panicked child. Her face, so like a child's, striving to understand some vast remote mystery. When he's just like talking to her about normal stuff. And she's like, I don't know how to use my brain. I am a child.
How do you even think that way about a grown woman?
Right?
How could you even imagine a marriage? And he said directly that this is a self-insert for his wife.
Yes.
So this is how he sees his own wife.
Yes.
Richard Matheson thinks his own wife is an emotionally weak child woman.
Yes.
That is so wrong.
Yes. It's absolutely disgusting.
Wow. Again, not at all what happens in the movie. She is such a good character in the movie.
It's so upsetting. She's not a character at all in the book.
Wow.
Yeah.
She is a character in the movie where much of what we know about her can be inferred through the way that she's filmed and the set dressing around her.
Yeah. It's been at least a decade, probably longer since I've seen this movie, so I don't remember super well. But I remember her not being in it much, but still being really impactful in the scenes that she's in.
Yes.
And she's not in it much in the book, and when she is described as a child woman.
Wow. One of the things I love about the movie is the way that it shows healthy communication. And we see that in Chris's memories of Annie. Like, even he has one memory early on where the family dog is going to be put down.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the movie, like, begins its thesis on grief
Mm-hmm.
and how grieving is good.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many ways to do it, where it shows Annie explaining to their daughter Marie that when the dog goes to the vet, she's not going to get better. And Marie is upset and is like, "You mean you're going to kill my dog?"
Mm.
And Annie says, "I'm going to help her die." And talks about like how hard it is. And Marie doesn't want to be comforted. Like, Annie tries to take her hand and Marie pulls away from her and like won't look at her and is just mad.
Mm-hmm.
And Annie says, "You get angry and that's okay." And she like teaches her daughter about grief sort of in this moment of losing the family dog.
I saw a quote recently. I don't remember who it was by. I will Google it real quick. It is by... It is not coming up who said it, but the quote is, "I sat with anger long enough until she told me her real name was grief."
And that's, I don't know, the movie like takes us through the different stages of grief.
Mm-hmm.
And the only one that it really condemns is the one that ends in suicide.
Mm.
But for the most part, like, Annie's the one who teaches her daughter about grief. And then later on, like, Annie's the one who points out to Chris that Ian's not doing well in school and he needs his dad to talk to him about it. And that's why Chris takes Ian out into the woods for a day of fun and they have a conversation. Like, Annie is a good mother and smart, and it shows how she and Chris talk to each other without being nasty, even when they disagree.
That's so great.
Yeah, like, it shows them having adult married people conversations about life and the kids and all of that. And Annie is like so intrinsic to who Chris is as a person, and who he becomes is because of Annie's influence on him. And all of that is shown through tiny little scenes.
That is so great.
Yeah. So to hear that she's nothing in the book and is just a woman child is so upsetting.
It's... I hated it.
Yeah. The movie is really about their romance and their relationship to each other, but I feel like so much of, like, we see Annie through Chris's eyes for the most part, but it's not like, it's not done in any kind of like, I need this woman and I have to possess her. It's like they literally can't be without each other, and it's mutual.
That is how it reads in the book. I have to possess her type of feeling, rather than it being about love. And mutual, because love, a huge part of love is mutual respect, and that's just not there.
Oh, that's so disappointing.
It's terrible.
And so interesting to me then that there's that quote that I can't find to credit that wouldn't it have been a good movie if it was based on your book, is like, no.
It would not have
It probably would have been a really bad movie. It sounds like they changed all the things that needed changing.
Yeah.
Except for the suicide thing.
Yeah.
But man.
Yeah. So when they talk about reincarnation, so real quick, when he is going into the house in hell, this is another instance where it's like, have you never heard of editing? Because he starts to describe the way that everything looks and how it's all run down and horrible. And then again, he stops dead and he goes, "I thought again of what Albert had said before he left me," because he goes alone into the house. And it's a paragraph of what he said about how dangerous this is and how it'll be hard. And then goes back to describing stuff. And like, you could have just switched those first two paragraphs.
Yeah.
And then you wouldn't have had to start with, "I was halfway up the hill now, how dreary everything appeared. I've described the driveway already."
Yeah, that's clunky.
Clunky. Have you never heard of editing?
So in the movie, a visual that I really love is when they reach the house that Annie has created in hell. It's not placed like as if they're in the real world. the house is detached from everything. It's just the house, no driveway or yard or anything. And it's hard to describe, but basically it's like in the center of what would be the ceiling of a chapel, but it's upside down.
Interesting.
So the whole room is they're standing on the ceiling of a chapel. So you have like those huge gilt arches, you know, in like a domed chapel ceiling. But that's the floor. So the floor swoops up. And right where all of those swoops begin is where the house is placed.
Wow. That's really cool.
And I thought that was a good use of religious iconography, that it's like too complex for me to articulate the way that I perceived it, but almost like, you know, let's say that Chris and Annie are Christian. I have no problem with them being Christian. Yeah. The idea that Annie is still tied to her faith, but because of her misery, it's upside down now. And that she's still placed herself within the ceiling of a chapel where maybe she feels safe. But even within that, she's still so miserable.
Yeah, I like that.
But you know, that like even, I mean, yeah, I hate that that's how they presented depression, but I don't think there's even anything wrong with saying that when someone dies in the midst of a depression, whether it be by suicide or not, that maybe that would affect their afterlife. Like, I don't have a problem with that. My problem with it is this idea that there can be no changing it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that it would have been inherently bad had Annie ended up in her own personal hell the way that she did, but to have everyone say you can't save her instead of just, this happens sometimes when people die while they're depressed and it's more work.
Yeah, they need extra help.
Them. Right, they need extra help guiding them into what can be a beautiful afterlife.
Yeah.
So I have no problem with the imagery surrounding Annie's hell. I just wish that there wasn't the rhetoric of she did this to herself and there's no changing it for her.
Right. She made a choice, otherwise she wouldn't be in hell. Like,
suicide is not a choice.
What the fuck is wrong with you?
I know that you know this, but I'm saying it for the benefit of anyone listening. Suicide is not a choice. Yeah. Suicide is an unfortunate consequence that sometimes is what happens when someone gets depressed. Yep. It's not a decision.
Nope.
So in the book, what happens when he goes in the house and like sees her in hell? What kind of like interaction do they have?
So I forget how many chapters it is. It's probably 5 or 6 chapters.
Wow.
This book is so unnecessarily long. Like, it is 288 pages long. And I Am Legend, which is also by Richard Matheson, which I actually love that book. So, like, he can write a good book.
Okay, good to know.
That one is only 167 pages long. So that's not quite half, but a lot smaller.
Cool.
And just so much of this book was unnecessary. And, well, okay, again, it's more like he was trying to... all of what was unnecessary to the story was integral to illuminating his universal truth. So... Right. Anyway, it's like 5 or 6 chapters, and he gets there, and actually, so, trigger warning for the dog dies.
Okay.
Because they do have their dog that he meets in heaven that was put down, Katie.
Yeah, that happens in the movie.
And in this, they had another dog when Chris died in the car accident. Her name is Ginger, and Anne dies of suicide. And then the dog stops eating until she also dies.
What the hell?
And is in hell with Anne.
What?
Yeah.
So dogs, if they die by suicide, also go to dog hell?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, it's...
They're dogs, Richard Matheson.
All dogs go to hell if they commit suicide. Oh, excuse me, if they die of suicide.
I don't think that dogs have the emotional capacity to invent an afterlife for themselves.
I don't know what to tell you.
Dogs, and I think that they're highly emotional beings, but I'm sorry, I don't think that their minds do that. I don't think that a dog can commit to torturing itself in the afterlife. That is messed up.
Yeah, it's Not my favorite thing.
I think if a dog followed its owner to hell, that dog would do a great job of pulling that person out of hell.
Right?
And you can fight me on that.
Right?
Oh my goodness.
So Ginger is there.
Wow.
And Chris has to lower his vibrations real low in order for Anne to see him and talk to him.
Because the more depressed you are, the lower your vibration.
Correct. And so she doesn't recognize him, and he tries to manipulate her into recognizing that she's dead and has died of suicide and is in hell.
Okay.
Through, like, he introduces himself but doesn't say his name, but then is like, oh, I see you have a dog. Is her name Ginger? I also have a dog named Ginger, kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the point where after like 5 or 6 chapters of this, of like talking to her, trying to convince her that she's died, and her being like, I'm not dead because there is no afterlife, and fighting him on it, she, you know, her face so childlike, striving to understand some vast and remote mystery.
Shit.
Right. And he can't convince her, and at some point she starts to like understand it, and then like is so depressed that she like actively rejects understanding it.
Okay.
And after he spends like 3 pages thanking her for all of her hard work in life, he's like, thanks for birthing my children, which is, you know, it's not at all the most misogynist monologue I've ever read.
Wow.
And so she like almost has a moment of understanding and then actively rejects it, and he has a cry and then decides to stay in hell with her forever so that she won't be alone in this horrible afterlife. And him lowering his vibrations just that one step further so that he'll be trapped with her forever, she then recognizes him and simultaneously recognizes that they're in hell, and is like, you did this for me? And then that gives her the strength to not be in hell anymore, I guess.
Tight. Okay. Okay. So they did that better in the movie, too.
Really?
Yeah. Shocking, I know.
What a surprise!
It does sort of play out the same. He does go in there and, like, she doesn't recognize him, but he doesn't. I mean, he is in some way trying to manipulate her, but manipulation sounds really malicious.
Yeah, it just reads as really malicious in this.
Yeah, it's not in the movie. In the movie, because everyone has said you can't save her, she's not going to know you, and she can't recognize what she's done, all that, you know, whatever. He doesn't go in there trying to prove to her that she's dead.
Mm-hmm.
He just goes in there trying to connect with her. So he like tries to feed into her delusion just enough to start to change it.
Mm-hmm.
So like at first he says like, oh, I'm your neighbor, this and that, and he ends up telling her like, he ends up saying like, oh, I knew this woman whose family died, and he like starts telling their story to her as if he's talking about someone else. And you can see Annie get like distressed, but also like wants to know that there's a happy ending, so she's gonna listen. And so he tries a couple of times. He ends up saying like, oh, she says when you're dead you disappear, and he says no, that's not true, and he starts to tell her about his experience with the afterlife without saying that it's him and that they're dead. And he says, you know, you can see the dead afterwards. All you have to do is like want to, you know, all you have to do is like close your eyes. You can do whatever you want. And she says, she calls him Christy in the movie. And so she says, I just want to see Christy. And he says, you can just close your eyes. And he like, it's shown throughout the movie that you can sort of guide someone's mind in heaven. Like that's how they travel, is they like shut their eyes and connect in a spiritual way, and then they're somewhere else.
Yeah.
So he has her close her eyes, and then he sort of puts them in the memory of the day they got married. And so it shows them like down the aisle, and she's obviously like really happy to see him. And he says, Annie, this is real. it's really me, the man in the house, that's me. And she loses it, which again, this is a heartbreaking moment. And it's all down to, I don't know how to pronounce her name. I think it's Annabella Sciorra. I'm not sure, but she plays Annie, and she is so fantastic in the way that she portrays absolute misery. Where when he says, it's me, I'm the man in the house, her face just collapses.
Oh, man.
And she rips off the veil, and as she rips it off, they're immediately back in the hell house. And she starts screaming at him about, you can't take my husband from me, whoever you are, I don't know you. It's so devastating. And that's when Chris realizes that maybe everyone was right, and maybe he can't connect with her anymore. So he sits by her and he says, he does his whole thank you monologue, only it's not misogynistic. It's Robin Williams.
Right.
So he's able to imbue it with that little tiny bit of not humor per se, but like, part of it is he says that one of the things he's sorry for is that he's never going to get to buy her another meatball sub. And it's just those things that it's like, man, like, and it's Robin Williams, so he's able to deliver it with that kind of like, just that emotion that he had, that like, you're already crying and then he says that and you're like, damn, now I'm also crying about meatball subs. Like, it's sad. But yeah, he thanks her for, the kids and for the life they had together and all of that stuff. And then he goes back outside to Albert and basically is like, yeah, I guess you were right. And Albert is like, did you come close to losing it while you were with her? And Chris says, yeah, a couple of times. And then he's like, can you tell my kids that I love them and I'm not going to leave their mother?
Oh my God.
And then he goes back in the house.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he goes back in the house. He sits down in front of Annie, who still does not know who he is. He tries to take her hand and she won't let him. And he just says, okay, babe, where are we going?
I'm going to cry. I didn't even watch it.
No, it's devastating. I'm just, by this point in the movie, I am just full on sobbing every time I watch it. And yeah, and he basically is like, in a minute, I'm not going to know you and you're not going to know me, but we're going to be here together. And, and that's how it is. And this is a parallel to the conversation they have when Annie is in the hospital after her first attempt at suicide, where it's all about how she feels left alone by him. And that he couldn't be with her in her grief. He couldn't join her. And so this moment where he decides, I'm going to join her and be just as miserable as she is the thing that brings them together the same way it did when they were off.
Love that. That is so beautiful. And so
right when she recognizes him, he stops recognizing her. But because she has connected with him now, she's now able to pull him out of hell.
Wow.
So they save each other in the movie, and I love it. Yeah. And when they're in heaven afterwards, he has no memory of how they got out of hell, but they end up together in his heaven, and
their heaven.
It's their heaven. And he's like, what happened? How did we get here? And she says, well, travel here is like everything else. It's all in your mind. And he's like, I don't understand. Like, how did you do this? And like, I tried everything to save you. I don't understand. And she's like, but the thing that worked was you joined me.
See, that's so much better than the way it's presented in the book.
I know, it's beautiful.
It's like kind of the same idea, but
it's just presented so much better.
Oh, that's a lot. I love that.
It's a lot. And I want to talk about, because I mentioned colors earlier, but I only talked about two of them. But this ties in really the way that Annie's character is filmed. And again, like I said earlier, the set dressing and everything is a huge part of how we come to understand her character. Where when they first meet, she's wearing like loose clothes, like summer dresses. She has really long, curly, wild hair. And that's how we're introduced to her, as this like loving, joyful person. And then after the death of the kids, we don't see her at first in her like deep, deep depression. We don't see that until later. But what we see at first is her 4 years later, and has a really severe short bob haircut, straight across bangs, and she's wearing very structured tailor garments. So she's gone from this very like free-spirited, open, loving, emotional person to obviously like has closed up a little bit to protect herself. And we also see her go from wearing bright colors and white to wearing all black. So you see this huge difference in what grieving her children did to her.
Yeah.
And one of the first scenes, I think it's the first scene that we see her after the children have died. She's in her art gallery that she runs, but the whole space is stark white. And she's sort of framed in this round cutout window on a staircase where everything around her is just stark white, straight walls. And she's this tiny little black figure amongst all of this white. Which to me reads as she's still in that depression and that grief.
Yep.
And all around her is this white that she used to be able to touch, but it's different to her now.
Yep.
And white is again used when Chris dies. When he finally goes to heaven. It shows him running through a tunnel, which parallels how he died, but the tunnel is filled with white light. And I read that it's actually a visual reference to a Hieronymus Bosch painting. I think that's how that's pronounced. I think it's called Ascent of the Blessed. I forgot to write it down, but it's a parallel to that painting that shows someone entering heaven through a white tunnel. So we see white in the movie as representing like a transition from life to death, or vice versa, where like Annie used to wear white and then she doesn't. She's now surrounded by white, so she's alive but internally doesn't feel alive. We see Chris enter heaven through white. When he dies, it shows him in an all-white hospital room. And as he's going through the process of realizing he's dead, anytime there's a scene change or a cutaway, the screen flashes white.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then one of the things I loved with the use of white light is in the house in hell. So in the upside-down cathedral, everything is really dark. It's all desaturated. Everything is gray and black. But when he goes into the house, there are these shafts of bright white light that come down through the ceiling. Almost like a visual metaphor that there is still a way out and that life is still, even in the darkest parts of Annie's mind, life is still there.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah. And then when they come out of hell, when she pulls Chris out, first it flashes through him in water again. And then again, there's like the screen fades to white, and when it fades back in, they're in heaven.
Wow.
Yeah. So I thought that was really cool. And then the other main color that I noticed was blue, which I think I read it as kind of representing grief or like the healing process. Because I mentioned earlier when they have that conversation about their Double D anniversary, they're wearing blue while they're surrounded by green. But we also see blue both the day that the children die and the day that Chris dies. They have these huge blue trees in their driveway that are dropping blue flowers on those days. And it's framed where you see the van that the kids are in driving away down the driveway, and there's all of these blue flowers falling. There's blue flowers on the children's caskets, and there's blue when they discuss their Double D anniversary. There's a scene where Annie is at Chris's graveside while he's still a spirit and he's clinging on to her, where she's putting blue flowers on his grave, but she's also wearing a blue headscarf. So every time you see blue, it's like someone attempting to heal or like going through some kind of grief process. Annie wears a really pale blue nightgown the night that she dies. And then when she's in heaven, she's wearing a bright blue nightgown.
Well, and I like that she's wearing the blue headscarf representing that she's trying to heal. And Chris hanging around causes that to not work. Whereas in the book, so it's almost, I mean, no one's really at fault for her dying of suicide, but it's him hanging around contributes to her continued grief.
Yes.
Whereas in the book, she's just weak. So
yeah, and that's the thing is in the movie she's never really presented as weak.
Yeah,
which is why it's so upsetting that they frame the whole afterlife of depression and death by suicide as somehow like a selfish weakness, because Annie is not a weak character.
Yeah.
It's a shame, and it's like an incongruity where it's like she's this incredibly strong character who in a lot of ways made Chris a better person. They grew together. You know, she's a good mother, all of that stuff. She's this really smart, really artistic, wonderful person who just has mental illness and suffered extreme tragedy.
Yeah. So, after they go back to heaven, in the book, this was also upsetting to me. They do not spend any time at all together in heaven. Because he saves her from hell, but she still isn't good enough to go to heaven and has to immediately be reborn.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my god!
I know.
Richard Matheson hates women and hates depressed people.
He sure does.
Wow. I mean, he's dead now.
True. I mean, hey, maybe he's in heaven continuing to hate people.
I hope not. I hope that he has learned in his afterlife.
So she is reborn immediately, and again, to continue with how horrible their condemnation of suicide is, so she gets reborn, and she has a handicap to overcome, which can counterbalance the negative effects of her suicide.
Oh, okay. Real quick, just to clarify, you used the word handicap in a quote. That was not you saying it?
Yes.
Okay.
That is in a quote.
Okay.
So she died of suicide by taking an overdose of sleeping pills.
Okay.
And so the body that she chooses to be reborn into, as much as it can be a choice when you have to be reincarnated right now because you're not allowed into heaven because you're not good enough.
You can't have any time to think about things or be at peace or process stuff without the weight of living. Just jump right back in.
Because you had such a hard time and suffered from depression.
Right. So we're just going to throw you right back into that.
Correct.
So messed up.
So she will have an illness. So this doesn't make any sense. She will contract an illness that will cause severe sleep deprivation.
Wait, hold up. Who's making these decisions?
It's the law.
Whose law?
The law. There's no judgment. It's just the law.
That's judgment, my dude.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
She, quote unquote, makes the choice, but again, she's not good enough to get into heaven, so she has to be reincarnated right now, and the body that is immediately available is this body that will have severe sleep deprivation.
What?
Yeah. So it's not really a choice, is it?
No.
And and she dies of suicide by taking too many sleeping pills. To balance the scales, she acquires a condition which would not permit her to sleep normally. How fucked up is that?
What scales are we balancing?
She did bad.
I need clarification. What is this, God? Did she offend God? That doesn't make any sense. There's no internal logic to that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they don't really explain it. They're just like, this is the law. Whose law?
Yeah. Who's in charge?
Because I need to fight them about this.
Because I also thought that the law was suicides go to hell and there's no way to bring them back, but Chris managed to do that.
Right.
So, who's in charge? Maybe just don't reincarnate her.
Or, if she wants to, fine, I guess. But
sure,
to have it be,
give her some time with her husband.
To have it be, you have to be reincarnated right now because you died of suicide, so you're a bad person, and your vibrations are too low to get into heaven, so you have to be reincarnated in order to fix your problem.
What problem? Her mental illness that she had no control over?
Yes. Her completely logical and free choice of dying by suicide.
What?
Yeah. So, and this, again, Chris gets reincarnated into a doctor.
Okay.
Specifically so that he can go meet Anne, who he knows will have this issue so that he can take care of her.
Cool. So even in her next life, she's infantilized and has to be cared for.
Yep.
Cool.
Uh-huh.
Cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What the hell, Richard Matheson?
Yeah, it's bad.
Man, in the film, I don't want to shock you or anything, but that's not what happens.
What a surprise.
So yeah, like I said earlier, she does get to go to heaven. She's in Chris's heaven with him. They have a shared heaven now.
Yeah.
She gets to see her children, which is nice. And they discuss reincarnation together of, do they want to do this? And it's presented as, first of all, it's a choice. It's established earlier that Albert has been reincarnated several times. He likes going back and doing stuff over. And Chris and Annie approach it as, we know that we can get to heaven. Like, we know what this is like now. We know we can come back here and be together. So do you want to do it all over again?
That is really cute.
Yeah, like let's go back and fall in love again.
That's really cute.
Yeah, and even like Annie's a little bit hesitant, and Chris is like, "Don't worry about the kids. They're supportive of it. They want us to go." And because time doesn't work the same in heaven, he's like, a whole human life is just a heartbeat up here, and they won't even have time to miss us, and then we'll be back and we can all be together. So it's all like a very positive thing, and Annie is like, we could go back and fall in love and meet each other all over again. Like, we could do it differently the next time. And she even says, like, how will I find you? And Chris is like, I found you in hell, didn't I?
Right.
He's like, don't worry about it. And then the very last scene of the movie shows two kids with toy boats on a lake, and the toy boats crash into each other. And then reincarnated Annie goes over and gives reincarnated Chris a little sandwich. And it's like these two little kids who meet. Yeah. And so it's like this thread of hope of like they're going to be reincarnated and they can do this as many times as they want. This idea that they're soulmates and they can just keep falling in love and living with each other.
I'm weak for that.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. No, in the book, it definitely leans on, again, the Tibetan Book of the Dead and this idea that reincarnation is specifically about the learning process and that you choose reincarnations based on what your soul needs to grow and eventually reach nirvana.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, that's fine, I guess.
That's fine. I just don't like the way Richard Matheson
approached it.
Like, I don't like, I have no qualm with that belief system. I just don't like Richard Matheson.
Right, and his combining the Tibetan Book of the Dead with the Catholic belief that suicide is the worst
Depression
thing.
is a choice and you're weak.
Yeah, and that suicide is the worst thing alongside murder. I don't remember what the exact quote is, but it's basically like, if you commit murder or die of suicide, you go to hell, and that's the only two examples that he gives.
What?
Mm-hmm. Murder and suicide are equally bad.
I can't even believe that someone would ever read this book and like lose their fear of death.
Right?
Sounds like people who don't have mental illness might lose their fear of death.
Uh-huh.
If I had read that book in the midst of my teenage depression, I would have been like, damn.
Right?
There's no hope for me.
Right?
Jeez. What's interesting is I watched this movie for the first time in the midst of my depression, and it gave me hope.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this movie actually was vitally important to me, and I didn't really realize it until this last rewatch, where it brought up a lot of feelings that I didn't know I had about this movie. But I watched it when I, like, needed hope about the afterlife and hope that depression wasn't going to be the thing that killed me.
Yeah.
That, like, even with all of the bad representation of mental illness, it's still, there's enough of a through line that the choices you make in life don't have to affect your death.
Yeah.
That, like, really, really helped me when I was super depressed. And it sounds like the book would have been the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never been particularly disturbed by my intrusive thoughts, but if I was, this book would be horrifying to me because of his experience in purgatory, where every thought you've ever had matters. And to have that idea coupled with the types of intrusive thoughts that I have would be like, oh God, I'm definitely going to hell then.
Yeah, that's messed up.
Yeah.
So I was looking at reviews because I wanted to see like what other people had to say about this movie. And I found Ebert's review from when it came out. And this was... We got to get into this because Ebert said first of all, he said that the visual effects were stunning and that he overall like really enjoyed the movie. But his criticism of it was, I quote, "The movie is so good, it shows us how it could have been better. It seems headed for a great leap. We can sense it coming and then it settles. If Hollywood is determined to shortchange us with an obligatory happy ending, then it shouldn't torment us with a movie that deserves better."
Huh.
And I want to know what Ebert's beef with happy endings is.
Yeah.
Because I did not see any kind of settling in this movie. I don't see what's wrong with a happy ending.
Yeah.
Especially for an emotional roller coaster of children die, a dog dies, the husband dies, the wife dies, they're trapped in hell. Like, and then what, you didn't want it to end happily?
Right? I think that's just a matter of some people just like it to be bleak. I mean, I still remember George R.R. Beard saying that The Lord of the Rings is really good, except Gandalf should have stayed dead. And like, so you didn't understand the book then.
Right. The other quote that I have from Ebert's review was, "I walked out of the theater sensing that I should have felt more, that an opportunity had been lost. What dreams may come takes us too far and risks too much to turn conventional at the end. It could have been better."
What?
Better how? Like I want him to have elaborated.
Yeah, to do a fix-it script, because I want to know what you think should have happened.
Right. Like, I'm really curious what he wanted from the ending of the movie, because it's Ebert, so he didn't usually go into that kind of stuff. But like, yeah, I don't see what should have been different. Like, and he keeps saying that this happy ending is conventional. And like, as if that's uncreative, and that the rest of the movie was so grand in scale that like...
Yeah, no, I feel like it's just that BS thing where like, if it's predictable, it's bad. That's the thing right now. Where like, no,
but this came out in 98.
Yeah. Yeah, but I feel like it's just that same beef that's
I
stupid.
guess.
It's
I just
okay.
I thought it was such a weird take of like, everything about this movie is great except that it ends quote unquote conventionally. Like, okay.
What is your problem, man?
Like, did you want Annie to stay in hell and be tortured for eternity? Did you want Chris to stay there with her? Like, what did you want to be different? Because I don't know about you, but I've watched this movie several times and I'm always emotionally wrecked by the end of it. And all I'm looking forward to is that moment where they're not in hell anymore.
Yeah.
Like, I need the emotional relief of knowing that this is not how eternity has to go for some people.
Huh.
I thought it was so weird that Ebert didn't like the ending.
That is super weird.
Yeah.
So, got any recommendations?
No.
No?
I mean, it's Robin Williams.
Yeah.
As the lead, one of the leads. Annabella Sciorra is fantastic, but I haven't seen her in a lot of stuff. I think the only thing I've seen her in aside from this is Chasing Liberty, where she plays a Secret Service agent. Which, she does a great job. It's a funny movie. I like that movie. But no, I don't. Like, what am I going to do? Recommend a Robin Williams movie? Like, pick one.
They're all good.
Most of them are fantastic.
Yeah.
Like, I guess if you want to watch one where he has sort of a similar compassionate but comedic role, like maybe Awakenings. He also plays a doctor in that one.
Yeah, I've never actually watched that, but I did read, so that book is based on a book by Oliver Sacks.
Right.
And I read his Oliver Sacks autobiography. I want to say it's called On the Move. Okay. It was really, really good, and there was a couple chapters describing how Robin Williams followed him around for several weeks in order to get his mannerisms down. And one day, I think he was flagging down a cab, and like he and Robin Williams made the exact same arm gesture at the exact same time, and then like looked at each other, and Robin was like, okay, well, I think I'm done following you around now.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, Robin Williams was by no means an unproblematic king, but
Right.
overall, a really good person.
I've never seen a movie that he was bad in, for sure.
Yeah, I don't think so. I feel like he was in some movies that were bad,
Good Will
but his
Hunting.
performance was never bad.
Yeah.
I never actually watched all of Good Will Hunting, so I can't say for sure.
We quit halfway through because it was so bad.
We did. It was really misogynistic.
It was really
I wasn't into it.
misogynistic. But Robin Williams was good in it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it gets better. I just didn't want to watch the rest of it.
Life's too short.
I mean, if there's a book, we might have to.
I think that it was really interesting to read this book and Sabriel back to back because there were a lot of interesting parallels. But as far as a recommendation, I'd have to go with Dark Matter by Blake Crouch,
Okay.
which has similar themes of existentialism and questions of autonomy and what it means to make your own choices. And the main plot is about a husband trying to reconnect with his wife. So,
Interesting.
yeah, it's not my favorite kind of book, but I did think that it was really well done.
Okay. I will say something that was interesting for me this month is I've been watching a lot of stuff for our next episode on The Haunting of Hill House.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, there's really similar themes in the Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House and the movie What Dreams May Come.
Oh, interesting.
The Netflix series focuses a lot on different kinds of grief and grief as something that can pull people apart, but also something that can bring people together.
Interesting.
So if you want to watch more things that deal with grief in a compassionate, well thought out way, I would recommend The Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix series, but only if you also can handle a certain amount of jump scares and horror.
Yeah.
But, we'll get into that next time.
Yeah. Yeah, for those playing along at home, next time is The Haunting of Hill House.
And if you want to try and cram in every visual adaptation of that, there's 2 films and a 10-episode series.
So, see you next time, Ian's and Albert's.
Excuse you?
What?
I have to give social media handles.
Oh.
I'm Hella Lambs on Instagram and Twitter.
I'm Convokes most places, Jimmy the Deer Boy on Instagram and Twitter.
And now.
See you later, Ian's and Albert's.
And, be kind to yourselves.
Yeah.
Be kind to yourselves, support the people in your life who need support, all of that good stuff. And come back next time to be scared.